Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation, when we're based in Toronto. Our organization is focused on combating anti-Semitism, defending freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the rights of persecuted minorities, and establishing interfaith alliances. We do this through education and advocacy and through truth-telling and myth-busting and working collaboratively with allied organizations. Our current major goal, for which we invite your support, is in abolishing the annual hate fest on university campuses that operates under the flag of Israel Anti-Apartheid Week. If you want to help, go to our website and you can join, or you can send us support to www.caef.ca. One of the most virulent forms of the anti-Semitism virus has, as many of you know, been spreading for decades from Iran and has now attached itself to the coronavirus pandemic. Our guest speaker is an expert on the Iranian regime's socio-political policies and behaviors. Before I introduce him, let me just explain how this webinar will work. After the speaker, you may send your questions by raising your hand on the little icon, hitting the little icon there, or sending a typed message through Q&A, and I will do my best to recognize you and allow you to ask a direct question to our guest. Once you've asked, I will mute you again so that everybody can hear the speaker. So I look forward to your interaction. Our guest today is Alireza Nader, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and that organization is also a co-sponsor, so thank you to FDD. Ali has a BA in Political Science from the University of California and an MA in International Relations from George Washington University. He's a Farsi speaker, familiar with Iranian culture, and has been providing political analysis on the current regime for over a decade, formerly for the RAND Corporation and then the Anti-Defamation League, where he is also now an advisor on their, or a member of their task force to protect minority communities in the Middle East. He's been much published, much quoted, and has been consulted by media and governments internationally. He's the founder also and CEO of New Iran, which is an NGO that does nonpartisan research and advocacy around the situation in Iran today. So it's my pleasure to invite Alireza Nader to speak.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I hope everybody's doing well. It's a pleasure speaking with you. I just want to briefly talk about the situation in Iran, especially in terms of the COVID crisis and how the regime has handled it, including blaming Jews, the United States Jews, Israel, Zionists, and what really this means moving forward. I believe that the regime in Iran's response to the COVID crisis has been one of the worst in the world, I would argue. In China, the regime in China, the Communist Party there, has gotten a lot of criticism. But I also believe that the Islamic Republic in Iran, which is also an authoritarian political system, deserves a lot of the blame for the spread of the virus. Regime officials in Iran have known about the presence of COVID-19 since late December. Most likely the virus was carried directly from China to Iran, either through commercial airline flights controlled by the Revolutionary Guards between China and Iran, or through the presence of Chinese seminary students in the holy city of Qom in Iran, which is also the epicenter of the pandemic. Although officials in Iran knew about this, knew about the presence of the pandemic or the virus since late December, they chose not to do anything about it. For the past several months, they've consistently lied to the Iranian public and the rest of the world, and have largely chosen to ignore the pandemic. And to this day, the regime has not taken adequate measures such as quarantining, imposing social quarantines, and the quarantine of hotspots like Qom. And the president of Iran has announced that everybody should go basically back to work. So Iran is really an outlier because while the rest of the world is practicing social distancing, a number of other strategies, the regime in Iran has chosen not to do that. Really, the reason for it is that the economy in Iran is doing very poorly. The regime does not want to cut off its own financial flows. The holy city of Qom is a major commercial center in Iran, but also the religious and political base of the ruling clergy. And the regime also wanted to make sure that parliamentary elections that took place on February 21st saw a relatively large turnout because its legitimacy and ability to rule over Iran is based on this charade that there's somehow some form of democracy in Iran and popular participation in politics. So the regime instead has decided to do what it does best, blame others and really amplify its anti-American, but especially anti-Semitic propaganda, which has not gotten a lot of mainstream attention in Western media, but it's a very big part of the regime's conduct. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, gave a speech on the occasion of the Iranian New Year, which was March 19th this year. And it was a very bizarre speech because he blamed the COVID-19 epidemic in Iran, not just on the United States, but also on what he called jinns or genies. A jinn in Arabic and Persian being the word for a demon. And Khamenei gave an extensive speech saying, quote unquote, that the jinns were working with foreign intelligence agencies to infect Iranians with COVID-19. And this was very much broadcast across Iran. Now, Khamenei didn't mention Jews or Israel having responsibility for this specifically, although he has a long history of anti-Semitism. He was a little more careful with this speech, but his office nevertheless decided to explain what he meant through its website. I'm trying to find the quote for you here. Oh, here it is. There's no doubt that the Jews, and especially the Zionists, previously have a long history of supernatural affairs and matters such as relationship with the devil and genies, and Israel's spy agencies also undoubtedly take advantage of these matters. And once Khamenei made this speech blaming demons and implicitly the Jews, the rest of the regime got a signal to launch this campaign blaming Jews very specifically for COVID. Members of the clergy and especially the Revolutionary Guards have been very active in blaming Jews, coming up with really wild conspiracy theories. For example, a study from Stanford that had collected DNA from Iranians years ago for research is now being blamed by the regime for being used to code Iranians, use Iranian. It's being blamed for using Iranians' genetic code to spread the virus, or even to create the virus as a biological weapon. And of course, Israel and the Jews have been blamed for this. And there are many, many examples of the regime using specific theories that it really has made up itself to pass on the blame to the United States, which ultimately is controlled by Jews according to the regime. And this has been taken up by all sectors of the regime. I think in the West, there's this tendency to divide the regime in Iran into so-called moderates and hardliners. But when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism, especially, I don't think there's really a division in this regard. I don't really believe in the concept at all. I think it's a big con that they're moderates within the regime. But I think that even so-called elected institutions in Iran have been part of this campaign. The Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, which controls all media in Iran, has also amplified the message that Jews are to blame for COVID-19. And as we approach the US presidential election, you'll hear more often in the US and Canada and elsewhere in the Western world that the world should negotiate with the Islamic Republic and come to a new agreement on the nuclear issue. But I think the regime's deep anti-Semitism demonstrates that this is a very ideological regime. It truly believes in anti-Semitism. It uses it to rally its own base and the Arab Middle East, especially against Israel. But there's a definite tendency among top regime officials from Khamenei on down, the clerics, the Revolutionary Guards, to really believe in these conspiracy theories. And so when we hear proclamations that there are moderates in this regime, we shouldn't forget the deeply ideological aspect of the Islamic Republic among all the different factions. And given that the epidemic is not over in Iran, since the regime has ordered most Iranians to go back to work, and most people don't have a choice because people in Iran can work from home or work remotely, we can expect a second wave or even a third wave of the epidemic in Iran. And the regime, I think, is one of the most, it's very poorly equipped to handle it, but I also think the regime's strategy is to let the pandemic run through Iran and create a herd immunity. But as we see additional waves of the pandemic, I expect the regime to resort to even greater use of anti-Semitic tropes to push the blame away from itself. ADL on social media, and I think a number of other, using number of other mediums in the last couple of days has discussed anti-Semitic cartoon contests being launched in Iran. I have to say, with some very, when I say sophisticated graphics in terms of just the quality of the graphics, not the content. So we see these cartoons and competitions really making a comeback in a way we haven't seen since President Ahmadinejad's time. His presidency was very much defined by anti-Semitism, and we see a return of that during President Rouhani's presidency. And keep in mind that Rouhani's often called a moderate as well. So on the anti-Semitism front, the Islamic Republic remains the most vociferous proponent of anti-Semitism. It uses it for its domestic and international goals, and I do not expect that to change as long as this regime exists. I think the silver lining in all of this, if you will, is that the vast majority of Iranians have very low trust for the Islamic Republic. They don't believe what the regime tells them, especially after the COVID epidemic, but keep in mind also that Iran experienced a very widespread revolt in November of 2019, which was violently crushed. And so Iranians have really lost trust in the regime, if they had really any trust in this regime before. And the Islamic Republic of Iran's broadcasting also is, has very low trust levels. A lot of Iranians get their information from outside sources, Persian language broadcasts from London are widely watched. Social media is very popular in Iran. And so I think that one of the best ways to combat the regime's anti-Semitism is to provide as much as information to Iranians within Iran to counter Khamenei's conspiracy theories. Of course, a section of the Iranian population, particularly those that support the regime, will always believe in these anti-Semitic tropes. Anti-Semitism does have a long history in Iran, although Iran has been historically the home to a large Jewish population that fled Iran after 1979, but it's present. And I think one of the major reasons for anti-Semitism is just lack of education and information. And Iranian media that have been based outside the country in the last few years have been trying to combat anti-Semitism in a significant way. More documentaries about the Holocaust, etc. So I think that's what we, those who try to combat anti-Semitism, really need to focus on highlighting the regime's use of anti-Semitism to escape blame. And we'll see greater uses of that in coming months and years. And also providing information to Iranians. I think that's very, very crucial. And it's that this is a long-term battle. I don't think this is anti-Semitism is something that can be countered and defeated effectively in the short term. I see it as a years-long, decades-long process to provide information and education to Iranians and change a lot of their attitudes on this issue. But I think there have been some positive developments in that regard. Having said that, I welcome any questions you may have, and I'll try to answer them as best as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions I'll lead off with while people get ready to put up their hands. Are there any generational differences in Iran in terms of younger people who maybe do access social media feeling differently from the older generation as well? I know there's differences in terms of levels of orthodoxy, obviously, but what about between the generations?
There's a huge gap between the ruling elite in Iran and the younger population. The ruling elite are mostly older clerics and revolutionary guards and Islamist and revolutionary in belief, whereas the vast majority of the young population in Iran reject the Islamic Republic completely, want a separation between state and religion, have tremendous distrust for the clergy. In the last 2 years, Iran has been very turbulent and has experienced many public demonstrations and even riots and uprisings. And a key feature of all of them has been opposition to the clergy. Clerics in Iran are extremely unpopular. You hear stories all the time about them being attacked on Tehran streets, for example. And to me, I think it'll be curious to see how, that part of the population, the younger population, the more progressive, progressive with a small p, and more democratic inclined population sees the issue of anti-Semitism. We can't conduct polls in Iran to measure these things. I don't think polling in Iran is trustworthy because the regime can control and monitor it very effectively. But I think as Iranians have gained access to information on issues like anti-Semitism in Israel, as they've gained more information, I suspect that a lot of Iranians have a very different view. Not just that, different views, not just from the Islamic Republic, but also their parents' generations as well. You know, for example, even before the revolution, I knew there was a lot of anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist sentiment in Iran. But Iranian society has changed dramatically since 1979 in ways that I think are incomprehensible to most people who can't go to Iran and see it. So I hope one day that will be revealed, that the population feels very differently. And I think there's, you know, a lot of space to work on that.
Okay, I have a question now from Diane Keefe. Diane, are you there? I've unmuted you. Are you there? Diane? No? Okay, I'll go to Morris Fremar. Morris, are you there?
Yes, I'm there.
Go ahead.
My question is the reported number of deaths from COVID-19 in Iran right now stand at 4,683. I've also read that the true death toll is much higher. What's your opinion? And how many would it be?
I think the true death toll is much, much higher. There's
high?
really, I've seen estimates of 10 to 15,000 with 60 to 70,000 people infected, but it could be much higher than that even because the regime in Iran is not keeping track of it. It wants to keep the numbers low, just like the Communist Party in China. Because we hear a lot from China too that there are no new infections and deaths have been reported to be much lower than suspected. For example, just in Wuhan, 40,000 people are thought to have died from COVID-19. So I find it very hard to believe that Iran, with less resources and capabilities that China, could have kept the numbers so low. Even I think 10 to 15,000 is really low. There has been evidence of mass graves being dug up. A lot of families are pressured not to say anything. Again, the regime just wants to go back to business. And this is a regime that doesn't really care about human life. Just in November, tens of thousands of people in Iran were either gunned down by the Revolutionary Guards or arrested, tortured, injured, you name it. And so the regime's approach to the pandemic basically comes down to if a lot of people die, then that's it. I think even Rouhani was quoted as saying, if 2 million Iranians die, that doesn't mean we're going to shut down the country.
I have a question from Murray Rubin. Murray, are you there? Oh, I'm pressing unmute, but it's not giving him access. Why is that?
Each person has to unmute their own microphone locally as well.
Why. Thank you, David. Murray, can you unmute yourself? Because I've given you access. You have to hit the little microphone on your own screen. I think that's what happened with Diane. Let me check. There's many questions here. I have a question from Barry Barnes. What can we do to counter the external effect of anti-Semitism as part of Iran's political strength and leadership influences parts of the Arab world?
Within the Arab world, I think, again, it's the same issue. Providing more information to the public, I think, is very helpful. There's been an interesting change in the Arab world regarding Israel, as a lot of the Arab countries, especially the Gulf monarchies, have moved closer to Israel politically in order to counter Iran. You see expressions of anti-Semitism among the leadership anyways decline quite a bit. Again, there's a population, I'm not sure. I think ADL would be able to best answer that because they've done research. but I really do believe it comes down to information. One of the best ways to counter are through television broadcasts. There are three very popular stations in London, BBC Persian, Manitou TV, and Iran International. Iran International is relatively new, but BBC Persian and Manitou TV have created some really good documentaries on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in general. I think that's been a really good introduction to the Iranian population on this issue. I think another way to really counter it is to push back against this concept of moderates within the regime. And incidentally, these same moderates and their advocates in the West, and the regime does have very strong lobbies, by the way, both in the United States and Canada. I was just in Canada in January. I'm doing a research project on the regime's influence in Canada. But
that takes us to the next question, actually. Maybe you could speak to that. Anita Bromberg, who is the president of CAEF, asks, how active is the Iranian government or its representatives in Canada? And how do we deal with the Al-Quds event, which is Iranian-led?
The regime's lobby in Canada is very active. I would argue they have the most effective, one of the most effective and widespread lobbying networks in the Western world. Just to give you an example, after Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, the specialized part of the Revolutionary Guards responsible for arming Hezbollah, Hamas, and creating chaos in the Middle East, after Soleimani was assassinated, there was a huge pro-Soleimani rally in Toronto, which I didn't find very surprising because I've heard from so many people about how active the regime is in Canada, but just that they had the nerve to show up in such large numbers in the middle of downtown Toronto with posters of Soleimani was just amazing to me. There are a number of institutions that are suspected of being very close to the regime. There's a member of parliament. There have been a number of stories about this member of parliament who's Canadian Iranian as having close ties to the regime. We know that a lot of regime officials have moved to Canada. They have homes there. They live very openly. Even members of Iranian intelligence, I've been told, live very openly in places like Toronto. I believe there's a lot of money laundering in Canada involving Iran. And unfortunately, the Canadian government has done nothing regarding these issues. It has not designated the entire Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. Only the Quds Force is designated, although Parliament had recommended to the Trudeau government that the entire Revolutionary Guards be classified. And we see how powerful the lobby is because they have set up organizations that constantly advocate for the resumption of bilateral ties between Canada and Iran, Canadian investments in Iran. And this is in light of the regime shoot down of the Ukraine airliner, which resulted in the death of, I believe, several dozen Canadian Iranians. I want to say 52, maybe 72. Yeah. And the regime in Iran has not provided any answers to the Canadian government as Prime Minister Trudeau had promised. And so I believe that really the only policy that works with this regime is not diplomatic engagement or investments, but just pressure. And I think the first step the Canadian government should take is to designate the entire Revolutionary Guard as the terrorist organization. And really, Ottawa should investigate the regime's influence and money laundering in Canada. And this is something that CSIS, CSIS should really look into. It's not a joke because if Canada is used as a base for the regime, it can get around a lot of things, including sanctions and pressure from the United States as well.
That might answer the next question, which is from Howard Rotberg about the financial situation. Are the Iranians in any way hindered by the financial situation Are they going to continue to fund Hezbollah and fight in Iraq and Yemen, or is there any impact with the sanctions?
Well, the maximum pressure campaign, the US maximum pressure campaign has really not just destabilized the economy, but put it on the verge of collapse. Iran is going to face a balance of payment crisis relatively soon. Oil exports are almost down 90% since the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear agreement. But you would think that a regime that's so strapped for cash that can't even spend money to fight COVID-19 would decrease its military expenditures, but we've seen the opposite. The Revolutionary Guards have gotten major increases in funding in this year's budget, as have religious organizations and propaganda organizations. And the regime still keeps shipping money, weapons, and medical supplies, even I saw today, to Hezbollah. Although thousands of Iranians are dying. So I don't think this regime is going to change its behavior whatsoever. To the very end, it will support Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. It's just in its DNA. It's part of its ideology.
Stephen Schaefer asks, if they are running this campaign to blame Jews for COVID, are they likely to take some kind of revenge against the Israelis or other Jews?
Well, I think in terms of striking Israel or targeting Jewish targets across the world, they have to be very careful because they're under a lot of pressure. But they have ample reason to retaliate against both Israeli and Jewish targets around the world because of the death of Qasem Soleimani. I think they're biding their time, frankly. Israel has been attacking Iranian targets in Syria and across the Middle East, even Iraq, very regularly, and the regime has not responded in a big way, but that could very well change in the near future. And I wanted to add one other thing, because we didn't talk about the Jewish population in Iran. There are an estimated maybe up to 10,000 Jews left in Iran. And I think they're a particular target. Now, the regime is very sophisticated about the Jews in Iran because it wants to claim it's not anti-Semitic. So it has created this fiction that Jews can live safely and openly in Iran, which is not the case. And I believe 2 months ago, there were demonstrations in front of the tomb of Mordechai in Iran, which is in Western Iran, in Hamadan, and the regime was threatening to destroy it. So both within Iran and outside of Iran, yes, we can expect physical attacks. Right now, the regime is resorting to propaganda more than anything.
Goldie Steiner asked if they were using this period to accelerate their nuclear production.
They are actually, yes. The regime has accelerated its nuclear program in response to US pressure. But I think they also see the nuclear issue as a way to blackmail the rest of the world, especially European countries, which tend to promote engagement with the Islamic Republic above all and want to keep the nuclear agreement alive. But we can expect the nuclear program to be accelerated substantially in the next few months, especially if the regime believes that President Trump can be defeated and Biden presidency would be more favorable toward negotiating a new nuclear agreement, which will well be for sure. And so that's the best stick the regime can wave. Either you give in to us or we'll create nuclear weapons, to put it simply.
Stephen Altbaum asks, given the strength of the Iranian lobby here, how can we engage the anti-regime Iranians that are within our country to counter this?
My advice would be, as Canadian citizens, to let the Canadian government know that it should take action, especially against the Revolutionary Guards, and to investigate the regime's lobby in Canada. And I don't think most Canadians are aware of how active the lobby is, because Canada, like the United States, is an open society, and it's relatively easy to create non-governmental organizations that pose as grassroots Canadian Iranian organizations. So they use those types of groups and other NGOs as well. Even the embassy, the Iranian embassy in Canada, used to create cultural and religious centers as fronts to spread its propaganda. So I think information, contacting your representatives, making it known to the rest of the Canadian population that this lobby exists. Canadian Iranians know about these issues very well, but I don't think the larger population is as aware.
I don't think they do, and I don't know if you said it specifically, but David Schlanger asks, and I think he's right, is there a member of parliament that has close ties to the Iranian regime? I think there actually are Iranians who support the regime within our government. Is that not true?
There have been reports of one member of parliament, I forget his name, I can look him up for you, that he is widely perceived to be close to the regime, yes. And then there are other groups, I won't name them because they're very litigious. Mm-hmm. In the United States, human rights activists have faced a lot of pressure from these lobbies. They've gone after them, they sued them, they harassed their families. But these organizations do exist. I can send you more information offline if you like.
Bonnie Shear asks, are Jews allowed to leave Iran? I knew there were 10 or 11,000. Can they leave if they wish? Yes,
Jews can leave Iran. Since 1979, I would say 90 to 95% of Iranian Jews have left Iran, mostly settling in the US, particularly LA, but also there's a large population in Israel as well. So Jews can leave Iran. They can't, if they leave Iran, go to Israel and come back and the regime finds out, they'll be jailed or worse. But I think the majority of the Jews who are left in Iran, they might not have the resources to leave the country. It's a pretty small population. There are a lot of Iranian Jews, in my experience, have a very deep attachment to Iran. They think of it as their homeland. And there are a few Jewish Iranians that may have stayed in Iran because of those reasons, but I suspect that they just really can't leave because they don't have the resources. And I can't imagine why. Well, I can't imagine why anybody would live in Iran, but especially Jews.
Well, Mita Hoffer asks, if you have the specifics, can you tell us how they launder their money here?
I don't. I'm looking into that actually right now because my project is relatively new. But I suspect there are a lot of currency exchanges, not just currency exchanges, but unofficial. In Arabic, it's called hawala. I don't remember the Persian name for it. But an informal way to transfer money, because Iran can't access the global banking system. It's totally cut off. So I suspect it's through mechanisms such as hawala and informal exchanges that they do it. But it's something that really nobody has looked into in great depth. And one of the surprising things for me is the fact that the Canadian government hasn't looked into this at all, because this is the world's top sponsor of terrorism.
Maybe the next question is related, right? Richard Fishes asks, and given the information even that you have and you're disseminating, how has the media identified or not identified the Iranian agents and the influence they have here? How have they not done it, I guess I would say.
I've had good experiences with the Canadian media so far, some Canadian media. I think just like the United States, there's this perception in Canada that there are moderates in the regime, the people we can work with, and if we're just nice enough to them and engage them, they might change their minds. And I think that's a very predominant view in the US media, and I found that in the Canadian media as well. I think the issue with the Canadian media is that there's not a lot of knowledge or awareness when it comes to Iran. So when certain media outlets like CBC, not always CBC, but sometimes CBC, when they want a story on Iran, they want to consult experts. They go to the more friendly.
Yeah, friendly Iranian here. Yeah.
And so the regime is really good at manipulating the media in North America. They have had a lot of practice doing that. So I'm hoping to really, that's a big part of my project, is to really inform the Canadian media as well, and have FDD be a resource for them on the issue of Iran.
You mentioned that one of the ways that some of the younger people get information is through television, but you also said a major effort has to be made in education. Charlene Brown asks, how do we educate a population that is under such extreme control by the government?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's very difficult because the educational system in Iran will not allow it, of course, right? Unless the regime completely changes, you have that education system that tries to indoctrinate kids with anti-Semitism. And I was educated in Iran. I lived there as a kid, and I saw that all the time. Besides television, I think the best method is social media, frankly. Iranians are very active on social media, probably more so than a lot of other populations, especially in the Middle East. So that's a good way to do it. But unless the country opens up and there's a regime, it'll be hard to do that. I think the intellectual discourse in Iran has changed quite a bit in recent years, and I have hope in that as well, because more secular, democratic Iran, a lot of them think of themselves as, they describe themselves as classical liberal Democrats. They're not from the left or the Islamist groups. They've really taken hold of the intellectual discourse, and a lot of them, and I know a lot of them personally, not only are they not anti-Semitic, but I don't know what the correct word for it is, but they're pro-Israel. They have good, not just, but there's a fondness for Judaism, I think, among Iranians too, that tends to be overlooked, because the two countries, Iran and Israel, had good relations before the revolution, and Iranian Jews did contribute greatly to Iranian society. So I think that could serve as a basis for changing hearts and minds, if you will.
Well, that might lead to the next question from Elizabeth. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Balicha. Is there an actual opposition in Iran with leaders that could make a difference?
In Iran, I believe there are underground cells that are active, but the regime will not allow any sort of opposition. So whoever emerges as a charismatic or popular figure is either jailed or executed. There are a number of opposition groups outside of Iran that are very active. But again, it's really hard to organize within Iran, because this is a very, very repressive regime. It's not like Solidarity in Poland, where the communist government allowed solidarity to exist. I mean, that's just one example. But when people ask me, if there are opposition groups, my answer usually is yes. 80 million people hate this regime with passion, including even religious Iranians. It's just that they can't organize within the country.
So they have to be active abroad.
And I think the opposition has become very active in the last 2 years. In December 2017, there were major anti-regime demonstrations across all of Iran. And since then, the opposition has just been much more active. More TV stations being created, more activism on social media, much more activism in the US and Canada especially. A lot of actually some of the most effective activists and thinkers are Canadian Iranians, I have to say.
Well, I just have a couple more questions. Gordon Berger asks, what do you think will bring about the downfall of the regime?
The only way the regime is going to fall is through the actions of the Iranian people. I think in the next few months and years, if the regime lasts for a few more years, we'll see additional rebellions and uprisings. I think the November uprising was the most important event, anti-regime event to have happened in Iran since the 1979 revolution. The only way the regime survived November, and regime officials have said this themselves, is that they just mowed down people on the streets, and the violence was horrific. And I followed it very closely on social media. It wasn't really reported in mainstream media, but the weakening of the regime's security force, especially the Revolutionary Guards, I think is key. As long as the regime has the resources to arm its people and kill regular people, it can stand. Well, my greatest fear is that if there's new administration in the US that's really friendly toward the idea of negotiations, it will take its foot off the gas pedal. That, you know, it will relieve pressure on the regime, especially as it is vulnerable right now, and cash will start going into the regime's pockets again. And it's a very probable.
As you speak about the violence, Anita asks, was the shooting down of the flight coming out of Tehran, was that unfortunate or targeted?
It was targeted, it was intentional. So the Ukraine airliner 752 had taken off from Tehran's airport, and because Qasem Soleimani had been assassinated, the regime was very skittish. Not assassinated, killed, that's the wrong word. The regime was very skittish and didn't take any precautions and just shot the plane down. And they've been trying to hide it since then. They're even contacting family members in Canada and telling them not to say anything. And they have refused to return the black box of the plane to Ukraine. Prime Minister Trudeau had promised to get answers from them, and we've heard nothing.
And money.
Yeah. And money.
So, I'll let the last question go to Morris Femer, who asks, since Israel is broadcasting, I believe, in Farsi, and so the question is, are Iranians listening to the Israeli broadcast? So
yes, definitely. Israel's radio, its Persian service is listened to. I think there's significant audience for it in Iran. I also think social media can be affected as well. And I wouldn't rate Israel's programs as being the most popular, but it's, you know, it's a significant, it has a significant effect on the Iranian population, I believe.
I wondered because also there is a significant Iranian population in Israel, and as you say, in LA, so Jews with an Iranian and Farsi-speaking background could be a significant contributor. Is that happening? Yeah,
definitely. Both in Israel and the United States. Some of the most committed activists tend to be Jewish Iranians, especially in the United States. So they play a very important role. Okay, and they get the culture, they speak the language, all of that.
Right. I think that brings us to a conclusion. So let me thank you very much, Ali, on behalf of everybody. We had at one point 105 people, I think, listening in. So I'm very pleased. I think it tells us that it's a very important topic. We want to stay in touch and learn more. And people, if you want, you didn't get your questions answered or you want to get in touch with Ali, I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you and have your questions answered. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to give them your email? I think it's
yeah. My email is Alireza, my full first name, ALIREZ as in zebra A @fdd.org.
Thank you.
Our website is fdd.org, so you can look me up anytime.
And I'm delighted that FDD did co-sponsor this. And if people would like to see more, give me feedback at Andrea with an I, ANDRIA, @CAEF.ca, and send your comments, and we'll let you know about the next topics that we're going to offer in Web Talk next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.